sun, a relentless disk of fire, beat down on the golden sands of Egypt. In the heart of Alexandria, a great siege was underway, not by an invading army from a foreign land, but by the very forces of a kingdom at war with itself. The fate of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and indeed the future of the Roman Republic, hung in the balance. At the center of this maelstrom was a man whose very name was synonymous with destiny, Gaius Julius Caesar. He had arrived in Egypt not to conquer, but to settle a dispute, to act as the supreme arbiter between two young, ambitious siblings, Cleopatra VII and her brother, Ptolemy XIII. They were the last vestiges of a once glorious line, squabbling over a throne that was rapidly losing its luster. Caesar, ever the pragmatist, saw an opportunity. He threw his support behind Cleopatra, the elder and more formidable of the two, recognizing in her a strength and intellect that far surpassed her brother. But the young king, Ptolemy, would not be so easily swayed. He saw Caesar not as an introducer, but as an intruder. His army, a vast and motley collection of Egyptian pikemen, Greek hoplites, and Gallic mercenaries, outnumbered Caesar's forces dramatically. Trapped within the royal quarter of Alexandria, Caesar's small army of just 3,000 men, the hardened survivors of his campaigns in Gaul and the brutal civil war against Pompey, were in a precarious position. The world watched, holding its breath. For weeks they had been a tiny island of Roman discipline surrounded by a sea of Egyptian hostility. Supplies dwindled. The air thickened with dusk, sweat, and the gnawing anxiety of a long, desperate stalemate. Then, a flicker of hope. Word arrived that an ally, Mithridates of Pergamon, was marching to their aid. This was the lifeline Caesar had been waiting for. He knew he could not simply wait for the siege to break. He was a man of action, a predator who thrived on calculated risk. Leaving a portion of his army to hold the defenses, he made a decision as audacious as it was brilliant. With a force of some 3,000 men, he would march south, meet his ally, and combine their strength to crush Ptolemy's army in the open field, a place where Roman tactics and discipline would reign supreme. The march began in the dry heat of February 47 BC. Every step was a testament to the grit and stamina of the Roman legionary. These men were more than soldiers. They were Caesar's brothers, forged in the fires of a decade of relentless campaigning. They were the 10th Legion, the legendary Legio X Equestris, and others equally renowned for their loyalty and ferocity. Their hobnailed sandals kicked up clouds of ochre dust as they moved, a slow, inexorable tide of steel and crimson. Their faces were weathered and grim, their eyes fixed on the horizon, on the river that would be their battleground. They moved with the silent confidence of a pack of wolves, each man knowing his place, each man trusting the man beside him. This was not a raw levy. This was a well-oiled killing machine, and its operator was the master craftsman himself, Julius Caesar. Ahead, on the banks of the Nile, Ptolemy XIII and his army of 5,000 awaited them. The young king was not a fool. He had chosen his ground with care. His army was positioned on an elevated plain, a natural fortress that granted him the high ground and a commanding view of the river and the surrounding landscape. The position was tactically sound, offering a clear advantage to his forces, which were a mosaic of martial traditions. Egyptian slingers, armed with their simple but deadly weapons, stood ready to rain down projectiles. A forest of deadly pikes bristled in the center, held by the disciplined phalanxes, a testament to the Hellenistic influence that still held sway in Egypt. And in the vanguard, the terrifying sight of war elephants, their great bodies a living bulwark of muscle and hide, promised a cataclysmic charge that could shatter any formation. Ptolemy, standing on his vantage point, must have felt a surge of confidence. He saw Caesar's small force, an army of half-starved, besieged Romans marching into his trap. He saw a chance to end this conflict on his own terms and prove himself a king worthy of the throne. He had been a puppet of his advisors, but now he held the reins. He had the numbers, the position, and the fierce, unyielding loyalty of his men. What he didn't have was Caesar's cold, calculating genius. He didn't understand the bond between the general and his men. He saw an army. Caesar saw an instrument, a finely tuned weapon of war, and its edge was about to be put to the ultimate test. The air crackled with a tension that was almost palpable. Two vastly different worlds, Roman discipline and Egyptian might, were on a collision course, and the fate of a kingdom and a queen would be decided by the first clash. Caesar knew this. He had come too far to fail. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, a fitting backdrop for the drama about to unfold. On the river, the first signs of the approaching ally were visible. Ships, the sails a brilliant white against the deepening blue of the water, appeared on the horizon. The promise of reinforcements, a beacon of hope, was drawing closer with every passing moment. The stage was set.
At last!
The actors were in place, and the first act of the Battle of the Nile was about to begin. The clash would be a test not just of strength, but of will, of tactics, and the unyielding spirit of a man who had conquered the known world and now stood poised to conquer one of its most ancient and formidable kingdoms. Caesar knew this. He had come too far to fail.
As the sun, a fiery orb in a haze of desert dust, began its descent, the air along the Nile was charged with anticipation. Then a new sound, a low hum that grew into a rhythmic thump, carried on the wind. Over the bend in the river, a sight of salvation appeared. A fleet of ships, sails billowing, their prows cutting through the placid water, emerged. They were not the sleek, disciplined warships of the Roman Republic, but a patchwork flotilla of barges and transports, each one laden with the promise of survival. This was the long-awaited
Call the palace
lifeline.
guard now!
This was Mithridates of Pergamon. On board the lead vessel, the man himself stood, a figure of a different world entirely. Unlike the stoic, hardened veteran legionaries of Caesar, Mithridates was an Anatolian prince, a man of the East, his armor and bearing reflecting a lineage as old as the Trojan War. His army was as diverse as his heritage. Pontic cavalry, swift and deadly, their horses bred for speed and endurance. Syrian spearmen, their discipline a contrast to the Roman shield wall, but no less formidable. And archers, their quivers full of arrows that would sing a deadly tune on the wind. Even a few hundred veteran Roman legionaries, men who had found service under a foreign banner, stood among them, a testament to the complex loyalties of a republic in turmoil. Mithridates' ships moored, and the disembarkation was a scene of disciplined chaos. Men and horses poured onto the riverbank, quickly forming up into battle lines. They were not marching on a road, but assembling with the urgency of men who knew their purpose. They had covered a great distance, their bodies weary from the journey, but their spirits were high. They had arrived in the nick of time. Their very presence was a message to Ptolemy, a declaration that Caesar was not alone, that Roman influence was not so easily contained, and that the scales of power were tipping. Across the great expanse of sand and river, on his elevated plain, Ptolemy watched the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and growing dread. He had been so certain of his advantage. His 5,000 men, a cohesive force in their own right, had the high ground and the terrifying psychological weapon of the war elephants. He had ordered his own reinforcements, men summoned from all corners of his kingdom to rush to his position. They had arrived just in time, swelling his ranks, giving him the numbers he needed to feel secure. But now with the arrival of Mithridates, those numbers felt less impressive. The sight of the Pontic cavalry, a fluid, menacing force on the flank, must have sent a shiver of unease through the ranks of his phalanges. The siege equipment, meant to pound the Roman front lines, now seemed less certain of its target. As the two forces, Caesar's and Mithridates, converged, the air thrummed with a new kind of power. This was more than just a simple reinforcement. It was a strategic masterstroke. Caesar's men were a hammer, a blunt instrument of pure, unyielding force.
Forward!
Mithridates' men were a
For
scalpel, designed for speed, maneuverability, and precision. The Pontic cavalry, unencumbered by the heavy Roman armor, could act as the eyes and ears of the army, being able to outflank and harass a slower-moving enemy. The archers could pepper the enemy lines from a distance, softening them for the Roman charge. This was a partnership born of necessity, but it was one that made the combined army far more dangerous than the sum of its parts. The two commanders met on the field, a moment of silent, mutual respect. Caesar, the seasoned veteran, his face a mask of iron determination. Mithridates, the shrewd king, his eyes reflecting the deep knowledge of this land and its peoples. There were no grand speeches, no elaborate ceremonies. A nod, a brief exchange of words, a shared understanding of the task ahead. They were two masters of war, and they were about to conduct a symphony of steel and blood. Caesar, ever the commander, took the reins. He gave his orders, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious time and time again. He integrated Mithridates' forces into his own grand design, placing the Pontic cavalry and lighter troops where they could do the most damage, on the flanks, where they could harass and encircle the more cumbersome Egyptian army. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the battlefield, both armies settled in for a long night. The air, which had been thick with tension, was now filled with the low murmurs of men preparing for battle, the sharpening of blades, the hushed prayers, the final tightening of belts and armor. On Ptolemy's side, the confidence of the afternoon had begun to wane, replaced by a nervous energy.
To glory!
The Roman alliance was no longer a distant rumor. It was a visible, tangible threat, a force that had arrived just as they thought they had the advantage. The war elephants, once a symbol of brute force, now seemed a vulnerable target for the nimble cavalry of the enemy. The stage was now perfectly set for the final, bloody confrontation. Caesar with his reinforced army would no longer just be a general fighting for his life. He would be the architect of a masterpiece of military strategy. He would use every tool at his disposal, the heavy legions of Rome, the light cavalry of Pergamon, the very ground they stood on, to deliver a crushing blow. The battle would not be a mere clash of numbers, but a test of will, of ingenuity, and of leadership. The next day, the sun would rise, not just on a battlefield, but on a grand, epic stage, where the fate of an empire and the legacy of its greatest general would be decided in a few short, brutal hours.
The first light of dawn broke over the Nile, painting the river in a pale, ethereal silver. It was a morning that held the breath of two armies, their fates hanging in the balance. On one side, the great mass of the Egyptian army, a vibrant tapestry of different fighting traditions. Pikemen, their spears held high, a bristling forest of lethal points. Hoplites in their polished bronze armor, a throwback to an age of heroes, and a handful of colossal war elephants, their deep rumbling calls a primordial promise of destruction. On the other side, a smaller, grimmer force, the Roman legions. Their armor was dull from the long march, but their discipline shone with the cold light of honed steel. These were not men fighting for a king they barely knew. They were men fighting for their general, for the honor of their eagles, and for the promise of glory. Ptolemy, standing high on his elevated plane, felt a surge of confidence. He had the ground, the numbers, and the advantage of surprise.
We march to glory!
He gave the order, and the low groans of his siege equipment filled the air. Catapults and ballistae, great, monstrous machines of war, creaked into action. A barrage of boulders and javelins arced through the sky, a deadly hail intended to break the Roman formations before they even reached the base of the hill. He believed he was facing a conventional enemy, one who would rely on a head-on charge, a brute force assault that would be easily repelled. But Julius Caesar was no conventional enemy. He had stood on countless battlefields and seen every conceivable stratagem. He knew that to charge headlong up a hill against a prepared enemy would be a bloodbath. He knew that the very ground Ptolemy believed was his greatest asset would become his greatest weakness. Caesar's plan was a masterpiece of military innovation, a blend of textbook tactics and audacious improvisation. As the first volley of Egyptian projectiles tore into the earth around his men, Caesar issued the command that would become legendary. His voice, calm and steady, cut through the growing chaos. Testudo. The order rippled through the ranks. In a moment of synchronized precision that could only be achieved by veterans, the legions transformed. Shields, the great rectangular scuta of Rome, came together. The men on the outer edge locked theirs into a wall. The men in the ranks behind them raised their shields over their heads, interlocking them with the shields of the men in front. The entire legion, some 2,000 men strong, became a living, moving turtle, a single, impenetrable carapace of iron and wood. The transformation was mesmerizing. The Egyptian barrage, which had seemed so terrifying just moments before, now merely bounced off this iron shell. The rocks ricocheted harmlessly. The javelins glanced off the sloped surfaces. The testudo formation, a tactical marvel, was not designed for speed, but for survival. It was a slow, deliberate march, an inexorable advance that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. Each step was a testament to the discipline of the Roman soldier, a quiet, unyielding refusal to be broken. They were an armored fist, and they were advancing up the hill, every stride a calculated defiance of Ptolemy's well-laid trap. But the testudo was only a part of Caesar's grand design. He was not merely surviving, he was setting a trap of his own. The main Roman force, a solid mass of heavy legionaries, became the irresistible force that would draw the bulk of the Egyptian army into a direct confrontation. Their slow, deliberate march was a magnet pulling Ptolemy's attention and his forces to the center. Caesar knew that a battlefield was a living organism, and its focus was a resource to be manipulated. He created a distraction, a seemingly vulnerable target that was in fact an impenetrable shield. As the main force trudged on, Caesar revealed the second phase of his plan. He split his army, taking a portion of his lighter troops, the Roman cavalry and Mithridates' more agile forces, and sent them on a wide, flanking maneuver. The left side, composed of his most heavily armed and numerous legionaries, would continue their brutal, direct assault. The right side, a faster, more fluid force, would move under the cover of the terrain, unseen and unheard, a phantom army on the edge of the battlefield. The intention was clear, to bypass the enemy's main strength and deliver a crushing blow to their exposed flank, or even their rear. From his vantage point, Ptolemy could only see the Roman testudo, a crawling, metallic beast that seemed to swallow his projectiles without effort. He ordered his siege engines to increase their rate of fire. His pikemen braced themselves, their phalanxes a deadly wall. He was so focused on the head of the serpent that he failed to notice its tail coiling around him. The dust, the chaos, and the sheer scale of the battlefield provided the perfect cover for Caesar's flanking forces. They moved with a stealth that belied their numbers, a silent current flowing around the rock of the Egyptian army, preparing to crash down upon them in a devastating flood. The stage was set for the final brutal act. The slow, relentless advance of the Roman legions reached the base of the Egyptian line. The testudo dissolved, and the shields returned to a fighting stance. The first pilum was thrown, followed by a torrent of javelins that tore into the Egyptian formations. The roar of the legions, a sound that had struck fear into the hearts of Gauls and Germans alike, now echoed across the plains of Egypt. The two armies clashed, a cacophony of steel and screams. But this was not the true battle. The true battle was being waged on the far flanks, where Caesar's genius would soon be revealed in a thunderous charge that would decide the fate of a king, a queen, and an empire.
The roar of the legions was a primal force, a wave of sound that crashed against the phalanges of Egypt. The testudo, that improbable shield, had dissolved, and in its place was the grim reality of Roman close-quarters combat. The Egyptian pikemen, a bristling wall of wood and iron, held their ground with admirable courage. They were a formidable defense, their long spears creating a no-man's land of death in front of them. The Roman legionaries, their heavy shields locked together, advanced with relentless pressure. They were a force of pure, unyielding will, an organic battering ram against which no static line could hold forever. The air filled with the screech of steel on steel, the heavy thud of shields, and the guttural cries of men locked in a mortal embrace. But the central clash was a bloody distraction, a canvas of carnage to draw the eye away from the true genius of Caesar's plan. On the flanks, a different kind of war was being waged. Caesar himself, a blur of bronze and crimson, led a contingent of his Roman cavalry. He was a general who led from the front, a man who believed that the greatest inspiration was the sight of a commander willing to risk all. With a thundering charge, they swept around the Egyptian flank, a whirlwind of horses and sharpened iron. Their target was not the infantry, but the exposed siege equipment that had been pounding the Roman advance. The Egyptian artillery crews, a soft, vulnerable target, were caught completely by surprise. They were no match for the speed and ferocity of the Roman cavalry. The great ballistae and catapults, once a symbol of Ptolemy's power, were silenced in a brutal, efficient massacre. Their crews scattered, and their machines rendered useless. But this was only one half of the flanking maneuver. Even as Caesar's cavalry turned to re-engage, another, more devastating force emerged. Mithridates' soldiers, the Pontic cavalry, the Syrian spearmen, and the Roman veterans under their command had moved with a silent, deadly precision. They had flowed around the far flank of the Egyptian army, a second wave of attack that Ptolemy had never seen coming. The sight of them, a force of fresh troops appearing seemingly out of nowhere, sent a tremor of panic through the Egyptian ranks. Their formation, which was designed to face a frontal assault, was now a death trap.
Retreat!
A phalanx, its strength derived from its cohesion and forward-facing spears, was now a fragile, vulnerable creature. The Egyptian flanks began to crumble. The surprise was total. Men, once standing shoulder to shoulder, now turned in frantic circles, their pikes and shields useless against an enemy that was not where it was supposed to be. Mithridates' cavalry, with a deadly precision, rode down the unprepared spearmen and archers. The air filled with the screams of men who had been caught flat-footed, their confidence shattered, their formations broken. The Roman legionaries in the center, sensing the collapse, redoubled their efforts, pressing forward with renewed fury. They had been the anvil, holding the Egyptian army in place, and now the hammer was about to fall. High above the chaos, on his elevated plain, Ptolemy XII watched in horror. The confident smile he had worn that morning was gone, replaced by a pale mask of shock and disbelief. He saw his flanks folding in on themselves, a great wave of panic spreading through his once proud army. The magnificent war elephants, a source of such terror and awe just hours before, now stood isolated and confused, their handlers frantically trying to turn them to face an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere at once. The battle was no longer a question of strength or numbers. It was a testament to the tactical genius of one man. Caesar had not merely met his enemy on the field, he had outsmarted them, outmaneuvered them, and now he was about to annihilate them. The Roman cavalry, having cleared the artillery, now swooped back in, their objective a total and complete rout. They charged into the panicked, fleeing masses of the Egyptian infantry,
cutting them down with a brutal efficiency. The battlefield transformed from an ordered clash of armies into a desperate, chaotic rout. The courage of the Egyptian soldiers, once so strong, gave way to the primal instinct of survival. They broke ranks, threw down their weapons, and began to flee, a desperate, disorganized tide of humanity trying to escape the relentless Roman onslaught. The great pike phalanges in the center, now surrounded, their flanks gone, were the last to hold. But even their iron discipline began to waver. Men looked to their left and right, saw their comrades falling, and saw no hope. The Battle of the Nile was no longer a contest. It was a brutal and final act of a brilliant military opera. The Roman legions, with their allies, were a flood that had breached a dam, and the once proud Egyptian army was being washed away in the torrent. The cries of the wounded, the screams of the dying, and the thunder of charging horses filled the air. And in the middle of it all, one man, Julius Caesar, watched his grand design come to its bloody and decisive conclusion. His gamble had paid off. The river, the very ground they had fought on, was about to become a monument to his military genius and a watery grave for the young king who had dared to stand against him.
The great bristling forest of pikes, the heart of Ptolemy's army, had finally shattered. Surrounded and outflanked, with no support and no hope, the iron discipline of the pike phalanxes finally gave way to the primal urge for survival. The men, exhausted and severely wounded, threw down their weapons and joined the panicked, fleeing tide of their comrades. The magnificent formation that had held the Romans at bay for so long simply dissolved, its soldiers scattering into the dust and chaos of the rout. The battlefield became a hunting ground. Roman cavalry, their mounts lathered in foam and blood, chased down the fleeing Egyptians, their swords and javelins cutting a bloody swath through the retreating masses. The screams of the dying mingled with the triumphant cheers of the Romans. But in the middle of this chaos, one man's flight was more desperate than all the others. Ptolemy XIII, the young king who had stood so confidently on his hill just hours before, had seen the impossible unfold before his eyes. He saw his flanks break, his armies flee, and his once certain victory turn into a humiliating, brutal defeat. At the moment of utter uncertainty, with the sound of Roman steel closing in, he made a decision that sealed his fate. He turned his back on his men and fled the battlefield. In the desperate melee, he and his entourage fought their way to the banks of the Nile, where a small boat awaited to carry him across to safety. The river, which had been the setting for his grand stand, was now his final, cruel judge. In the rush to escape the vengeance of the Romans, the small vessel was overloaded. The panicked soldiers and servants jostled and pushed. The boat, unstable and no match for the weight of so many terrified men, began to capsize. Ptolemy, weighed down by his royal armor and a heavy golden breastplate, plunged into the murky water. The river swallowed him whole. He did not rise again. The boy king who had dared to stand against the might of Rome met his end not in glorious combat, but in a desperate, undignified flight, a tragic footnote to a battle he had so confidently begun. As news of the king's death spread, the last vestiges of Egyptian resistance crumbled. The battle was over. The sun, now high in the sky, shone down on a scene of utter carnage. The battlefield was littered with the dead and wounded, a testament to the brutal efficiency of Caesar's army. But amid the silence that followed the storm, there was the quiet, profound sound of victory. The Roman legions, tired but exultant, reformed their ranks. They were still outnumbered, but they were victorious. They were Caesar's men. With Ptolemy's death, the path to Alexandria was open. Caesar, with his army now swelling with Mithridates' forces, marched directly to the city. The siege that had held him captive for weeks was lifted in a matter of hours. The gates of Alexandria, once shut against him, now opened, and in the heart of the city, the true prize of his victory awaited. He found Cleopatra, the queen who had risked everything, and in one of the most consequential acts of his career, he placed her on the throne. But to ensure stability and maintain a semblance of Roman order, he placed her alongside her other younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, as co-ruler. This was not a move of pure conquest, but a masterful act of political engineering, a subtle way of bringing Egypt, with its vast wealth and crucial grain supply, firmly into the Roman sphere of influence. The Battle of the Nile was more than a mere military engagement. It was a defining moment in history. It cemented Julius Caesar's reputation not just as a brilliant commander, but as a master strategist who could turn any situation to his advantage. It was a testament to the power of disciplined veteran troops and the genius of a general who could manipulate the battlefield with the mind of a chess master. Ptolemy XIII's confidence, his geographical advantage, and his overwhelming numbers had all been rendered meaningless by Caesar's audacious use of flanking maneuvers and the unyielding strength of the testudo. The victory at the Nile was the final jewel in Caesar's crown of military achievements. It secured his position as the most powerful man in the Roman world, and allowed him to bring stability to the volatile and economically vital region of Egypt. For Cleopatra, it was the start of a new life, a reign secured by a Roman general, which would eventually lead to the most famous love affair in all of antiquity. For the world, it was the moment when the last great Hellenistic kingdom bent its knee to the rising power of Rome. A small army, a genius general, and a desperate queen had changed the course of history on the banks of the great river. The sun, which had witnessed the clash of two worlds, set on a transformed landscape. Where once the banners of a pharaonic dynasty had flown, now stood the victorious eagles of Rome. This battle, a mere footnote in Caesar's sprawling military career, was in fact a quiet hinge upon which the doors of history swung open. It was a testament to the idea that true victory is not found in brute force or superior numbers, but in the audacity of a brilliant mind. The testudo, that slow, deliberate wall of shields, was more than a formation. It was a symbol of Roman discipline, an unyielding will against the odds. The flanking maneuver was a masterclass in exploiting an enemy's tunnel vision, turning a seemingly insurmountable obstacle into an opportunity for annihilation. In the end, it was not the roar of the war elephants or the bristling spears of the phalanx that determined the outcome, but the cold, calculating genius of one man and the unwavering loyalty of his men. The young king, Ptolemy XIII, was swept away not just by the currents of the Nile, but by the irresistible tide of Roman power that his opponent represented. His death marked the end of an era, a final fading gasp of the Hellenistic world that had once dominated the Mediterranean. From the sands of Egypt, Caesar's victory sent a clear message to Rome and the world. His power was absolute, his will was law, and nothing, not even the most ancient of kingdoms, could stand in his way. The battle was over, the siege was lifted, and on the throne of Egypt sat not a king, but a queen who owed her crown to a Roman general.